So good afternoon and welcome to chapter 2 then of this series of video lectures on the 1970s in the UK, which is entitled Social and Cultural Changes in the United Kingdom in the 1970s. And the objective is to look at some of these social cultural changes, but also to explore what the meaning is of social history, cultural history. What does it mean to look at the cultural history of the 1970s? So in the last chapter, I looked at some of the important political changes which had happened in the 1970s, and this poses the question of where is the dividing line between political changes and cultural changes. Obviously, political changes are generally considered to be decided by the government, marked by specific events which are fairly easy to see, like new laws, elections, declarations of war, and so on, whereas cultural changes are more molecular. Something becomes more popular but is never universally popular, and so on and so forth. So that's what the kind of things we're looking at. And certainly one of the priorities of cultural history has always been to look at the lived experience, as we say, although somebody pointed out to me recently that if you talk about experience, it is that it's lived. Nevertheless, we have the habit of saying lived experience. Interested firstly in the lived experience of ordinary people, and secondly in the importance of symbols. What did particular activities or conditions symbolize and mean for people? So not just what people did, but also what it meant to them. And these, of course, are concepts which are quite crumbly, which are difficult to get a hold of. So we're going to look at the 1970s, but also continue reflecting on this. What are the links between the political, the social, the cultural history? Well, if we're looking at social and cultural changes in the 1970s, it occurred to me that it might be as well to begin by looking at a few statistics. Again, the difficulty with statistics is you can have hundreds and hundreds of statistics, but if you have too many, you can't see the wood for the trees. But it seems to me that an important element of social and cultural history is life expectancy, how long you imagine you are going to live or your parents are going to live. And in 1970, indeed, life expectancy for UK men was 68 and a half years about, and for women 75 years. And you can see that by 2010, so 40 years later, men had gained 9 years and women had gained 7 years. So this is something which is important, because certainly part of the culture is how do we consider old people? How do we consider people who are old? And it's certainly true. And I remember, because I'm old enough, in the 70s, somebody at 60 could easily be considered old, or even more important, consider themselves to be old. Now, this is also a period when infant mortality is falling, and this sometimes means that people do not feel the need to have as many children, because they're not thinking of losing them. But it's also a sign of the rise and the strengthening of the welfare state. So, of course, the welfare state comes into action for most of it in the late 40s, the early 50s, but the effects of it continue for many, many decades. And indeed, infant mortality was continuing to fall. It was 17.7 for 1,000 babies born alive in 1970, and only 10 years later it was 11.9. And today it is only 4, so that the number of babies dying at birth is 4.5 times lower today than it was in 1970s, and there's still things changing. Now, why was this? Was partly better diet, partly better hospitals, better housing, and so on, and so forth. It was estimated in 1970 that there were 2 million houses being lived in which were unfit for human habitation, and 4.5 million more which were in urgent need of repair. And it's true that this did continue to go on. So although there is plenty of bad housing left in Britain, certainly the 60s and 70s were times when what we used to call slums, or slum clearance, was very important. What about the couple? What about how people saw their partner? Well, a clue for you: of marriages contracted in 1970, 22% had ended in divorce before the 15th wedding anniversary. of marriages contracted in 1995, 33% had ended in divorce by their 15th wedding anniversary. So that's like a 50% increase. Yeah, I know there's only 10 difference, but that's half as much again. This is always something which is very interesting in social and cultural history. You can get the statistics, and then you have the debate about what the statistics mean. Now, certainly in 1995, the number of women who were working outside the home was higher, and one might easily think, and I think it sounds certainly, in my opinion, it's true that more women had enough money of their own, wages of their own, to make it a little easier for them to leave if the marriage was not working well. The law also had made it easier, but I don't think that the law is the primary element. So it also became more acceptable, I think, to divorce. So that might have made it easier for people to divorce because it didn't hold quite the stigma that it used to hold. Remember that in the 70s, children from a family where the parents were no longer living together, we didn't talk about single-parent families, and certainly not of what you call today in French famille recomposée. We tended to talk about broken homes, a child coming from a broken home. And so you can see the very strongly normative side to this. In 1970, the median earnings of adult women were 54% of those of men. In 1983, they were 66%. Now, this was due to a number of factors. Sometimes women were still paid less for the same job, even if it was not exactly legal. But probably the most important factors are that men worked overtime while women did unpaid housework. And even more important, jobs, many low-paid jobs such as typists, nurses or shop assistants were in their vast majority occupied by women. If we look at the consumer side, because consuming is one of the things we do, you can see that things are changing in the 1970s. In 1970, almost half of all households in the UK have a car. We've got to that half level. In 2010, 85% will. In 1970, 65% of households own a washing machine. And this, you never realize how important this is until your washing machine breaks down. But certainly washing was a huge job before washing machines, and even more so before detergents, because using old-fashioned soap, it takes a lot longer. By 1980, then 79% will. So you can see that in just this one decade, you got 14% increase in washing machines, and you can see that the big home technological revolution of the 1970s is the telephone. In 1970, 35%, and in 1980, then 72%. So this is something that you used to ask people when you met them. You couldn't just say, tu me donnes ton 06, as I understand is the habit today. You would tend to ask them, do you have a phone? And also, there were sometimes community solutions to this. And so if anything was seriously wrong, you would phone the corner shop near your home, and the shopkeeper would go down to find the person needed. And it is in my lifetime, in the 70s, I remember this could happen. And finally, then in 1970, 30% of households have central heating. That is to say, heating by radiators in every room in the house, or almost every room in the house. And by 2014, 96% will. So you can see that it's something that became absolutely universally popular, whereas previously, in 1970, many people would have coal fires, or occasionally wood fires, but mostly coal fires, because the United Kingdom did produce a huge amount of coal. So all of that is some of the statistics to get us started. What about I have a few more for you here. In 1970, there were 11 million trade unionists in the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom was already and had been for a very long time, very much an industrial country. Nevertheless, there were 15 million cows, 26 million sheep, and 9 million pigs. and 140 million chickens. So there was a certain amount of agricultural things. So here we're in, to some extent, these are social and economic statistics, and they might help us to imagine what people's lived experience was. And of course, how people related to each other changes very much with the technology. If you have a telephone, it's different than if you have later a mobile telephone, than if you can send people messages by other means through the internet, and so on and so forth. And of course, in the 1970s, then people still wrote a very large number of letters, which obviously have both disappeared and transformed. They disappeared because normally an email or a text is easier to handle, but also because emails arrive immediately, they're very different from letters, and it's very rare to write a long email to personal friends. Some people do it, but the difficulty is you get an answer immediately, and whereas with the letter writing, it would take a few days, and so that allowed letter writing to live a different sort of life than email communication. Now, of course, looking at the social and cultural of the history of the 1970s, you're bound to come across a large amount of nostalgia. And nostalgia is an interesting object for the study of the social sciences. Of course, in many ways, we see it, historians see nostalgia as having negative elements, because it will tend to paint the past in a more rosy manner, or with rose-tinted spectacles. Things were so much better when I was young. And this fits into the ideology of declinism, which is older than the hills, as they say. Nevertheless, I think that nostalgia deserves to be studied as well. It could be seen as a form of alienation, that in a society where much control of our lives appears to be taken away, then some sort of compensation, some sort of psychological compensation, can be found in a series of mental lives and mental worlds, and nostalgia is one of those. So let's go through year by year to see what were some of the events, some of the cultural and social events, and sometimes political events, but not so much what the government did, but what larger numbers of people did, and see what happened there. Well, for example, in 1970, the very first female presenter on the popular music radio station BBC Radio 1 started up, beginning with a Sunday evening slot. And there's quite a few things that could be said about this, because of course rock and roll and the gradually emerging, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and the gradually emerging glam rock and disco, and the gradually emerging reggae and heavy metal, and all these tremendously modern ways of doing music were represented in Britain very much by BBC Radio 1, which only played, and only plays, music from the last year or so. However, being modern in the 1960s, from the cultural point of view, and playing the most up-to-date music, as the BBC Radio 1 did not appear to involve including women in a series of public roles. So in 1967, when the BBC transformed its radio stations and set up BBC Radio 1 for today's music, and that was modern, and it was hip, and it was rapid, and it was witty, and it was sarcastic, and it was in the move, if you like. They employed a group of, I think there were 23 radio presenters, and 23 of these 23 presenters were men. And so that might be a little bit surprising. I mean, I'm sure that everybody was expecting there to be a clear majority of men, but actually they were all men. So, and this was not, King's College, Cambridge, or some very, very traditional institution. This was pop music radio, and they were all men. And Annie Nightingale in 1970 is the first woman to get a job as a disc jockey. Now, I think this is tremendously important, because certainly popular music radio in the 70s was something adored by millions and tens of millions of young people. And the role of the disc jockey is not just to play the music, it's also to tell us what it means to be young and modern and hip and fast. And so having every one of these role models a man does seem to me to be symbolically quite violent. So the arrival of Annie Nightingale certainly rang the changes there, although this was part of an extremely slow process. And for quite a few years, she was the only one. And also, I mentioned that they put her on Sunday evening. It was much longer before there was a daytime weekday show for a female presenter. And the reason for this is that BBC management said, well, the people listening to the radio in the daytime, they are housewives. And housewives do not want to hear women. They want to hear, I quote, husband substitutes. So this is an interesting example of how rigid the prejudices could be. First of all, even objectively, in reality, there were as the transistor radio came into the market, there were more and more workers in workshops and lorry drivers, taxi drivers, hairdressers, more and more people listening at work. And so the idea that it was housewives listening during the day who wanted to listen to husband substitutes was actually empirically rather shaky. And secondly, as I'm sure you can imagine, the BBC management who was making this decision about what their listeners wanted were 99% men. So there, a little episode, if you like, in a chain, in one of the biggest changes over the last 50 years, and that is to say, the enlarged space for women in public. The actual story of Annie Nightingale is really pretty exciting, because today she is 80 years old, and she is still a radio presenter on the modern pop music show. She does a techno show in the middle of the night or something. So it had a happy ending for the individual. February 1970 is the date of the release of Black Sabbath's first album, just called, if I remember correctly, Black Sabbath, and this was certainly one of the very first key albums for metal, or what we used to call at the time heavy metal. And so this is something very significant in the 1970s, that the 1970s was a time which brought in a whole series of new genres of music, or accelerated them. And through the 1970s in Britain, glam rock, metal, acceleration of reggae, punk rock, synth pop, just to get you started. There were more than that. And so this brings up the question of where does this fit in cultural history? You know, what does it mean that a significant minority, still a minority, but a significant minority, wanted this new, louder, more aggressive, more symbolically contestatory, if you like, music, using satanic or anti-religious imagery, Black Sabbath, yes, the Sabbath being the holy day, black, suggesting Satan, and other of the groups was Judas Priest, Judas, yes, the apostle said to have betrayed Jesus and as a priest, yes, so mixing together these contradictions, using new kinds of voice. Before heavy metal, screaming wasn't part of the repertoire of popular music. So this new thing, well, what did it mean? Well, by this time, new genres of music and new experiments in music were wanting to express the aesthetics and the feelings of a younger generation. This was not always the case. 50 years earlier, the singer on the musical stage was expecting to please the member of the audience who was 15 and the member of the audience who was 55. They were watching the same music. But as you know, with the post-war boom, teenagers and young adults were having more money to spare, or having some money to spare, and so the record market existed, and you got this introduction then of this of the whole rock and roll phenomenon, which is not just a kind of music, but also an idea that a generation has a particular form of expression. So what did Black Sabbath do? Well, they came from Birmingham, which is an industrial part of town. Interesting, they didn't come from London, not from the centre politically. And the sounds that they used, well, or what they said in any case in their interviews, is that they wanted sounds that resembled the factories they walked past on their way home, the factories that their friends worked in. And it has been suggested that there is a link between the sounds of any particular decade and the music. So metal and lighter forms like glam use sounds which resemble in some ways machines, industrial machines, whereas 15 years later, or even 10 years later, but 10 or 15 years later, the synth pop and then later on techno will be using the sounds of computing that we hear, the beeps that we hear, especially synth pop, the beeps and artificial voices that we hear around us. And so the sound has a link, the sound in popular music has a link to the soundscapes which are around us. And so this is where does popular music fit in cultural history? Big question. For a very long time, the history of music was kept separate from the history of society, which was somewhere else. And people who studied the history of music studied who had influenced whom. And what was the history of the forms, the symphony, and so on. And historians of popular music for a while did the same thing. So, well, let's have a look. Where did Black Sabbath get the inspiration for the way they played the guitar? But there is a link between popular music and society, and exploring it, I think, is quite worthwhile. Something much more political, but again, not old-fashioned political history in the sense that it's not what laws were passed by the governments or which governments were elected. And this was that in 1970, in February, the first ever UK National Women's Liberation Conference was held in Ruskin College, Oxford. Now, this is to say that it was a National Women's Liberation Conference. It was not organised by any of the political parties, although some of them were more sympathetic to others. And so this is really quite an impressive event in itself, to manage to get together all groups around the country and have a national conference. So it's something very much very difficult to do, of course, and so for something very interesting. You see there on the left the program, Women and the Economy. For a 4-hour session on women and the economy, 3 or 4 hour session on the I can't quite see it. The social roles of women. There you go. Is it the sexual or the social roles? One or the other. And so your whole series, that's the whole program there. It came out of the workers' movement to some extent, from the point of view that Ruskin College, Oxford, the place it was held, was a college which had been established at the end of the 19th century by groups close to the trade union movement. In any case, this first Women's Liberation Conference defined 4 radical demands. They decided that from the point of view of visibility, it was good to have a small number of demands. If you have 23 demands, they don't get in the newspapers. And so the 4 demands were equal pay, equal educational and job opportunities, free contraception and abortion on request, and free 24-hour nurseries. Okay, and so all of those are very interesting. Now, some of them remained topical for many, many years. People are still demanding equal pay, and a lot of progress has been made towards equal pay, although one of the things that makes it difficult is that women are often either attracted or pulled into part-time jobs. And the last one, free 24-hour nurseries. Now, this was even more radical in the 1970s than it is today, because the idea that a woman who leaves her child in a nursery for too long is a bad mother was 100 times as strong in the 70s as it is today. Even today, you can, if the women, mothers get criticised for leaving their children too long in school, if they take them to the breakfast in school and that they leave them for the women still get criticised. Although that's par for the course in a way that whatever mothers do, they get criticised. So there is that. So those were the demands that went through. Now, the conference was mostly attended by women, but there was a minority of men, and the decision was made that the creche, you can see it on the bottom right, should be staffed only by men, thus helping the women to have time to be involved, and also reversing the symbolically traditional division of labour. Later in the decade, women's liberation conferences and other events would often be women only, although sometimes men staffed the creche. Indeed, one Liverpool men's network specialised in providing childcare, free childcare at women's liberation events to support the movement. So here you have something which is a large movement. Many thousands of people were watching the Women's Liberation Conference. I mean, I don't mean on television. I mean, they were interested to hear what was happening. And I don't know how many people were there, but certainly it's quite a large number. So this was a very important idea. It's a sort of grassroots idea that we can change the social position of women by this kind of activism. And certainly the women's liberation movement, because in the 70s it was big enough to be called a movement. I personally prefer, for example, today in Britain, I would prefer to talk about women's liberation networks because they're much smaller. So that was the Women's Liberation Conference. Completely different. In July, in 1970, in July, the British Commonwealth Games was held in Edinburgh. 42 nations took part. And this is part of the history of decolonisation, the history of the decline and almost disappearance of the British Empire. This event, held every 4 years, so was something which used to be from 1930 to 1950 was known as the British Empire Games. Now it's interesting, you can see it was established in 1930 for all countries which are in the British Empire. So it was established at a time when really the British Empire was already in crisis, let's say. They felt no need for a British Empire Games in 1880 or 1890 or 1900. And in fact, its establishment was part of this idea. So, well, yes, all the nations are important. Britain, of course, the British Empire began for the good of Britain, and the other nations, well, they were just being used. But they tried to develop this idea to make the empire last longer, that it was in the interest of all nations, and they would all compete as equals in the British Commonwealth Games along a similar ideology as the Olympic Games, if you like. Now, from 1930 to 1950, it was known as the British Empire Games. From 1964 to 66, it went under the name of British Empire and Commonwealth Games. In 1970, it was the British Commonwealth Games. And in 1974, it was the Commonwealth Games. So you can see by the changes in the names, you can see the tremendous tension about how keen the British leadership was to insist that it was everybody's. It wasn't about the domination of Britain, rather that gradually coming in there. But nevertheless, 42 nations took part, which shows that the British Commonwealth, which was established to go very quickly as a sort of soft power network to keep British influence after countries had taken their independence, was having a certain success in its own terms. So 42 nations were happy to take part. That's something that's really important. I'm afraid I don't know much about the Commonwealth Games today. Certainly would be an interesting question to study. In August 1970, in fact, this photograph is from 1968 because I couldn't find a 1971. The Notting Hill Carnival was marked by fighting between police and young black men. Now, the Notting Hill Carnival was first established after the 1958 fighting, where racists attacked the area, and there was a lot of fight back by young black mostly men and against the police as well. And it gradually became an important annual rendezvous to celebrate Caribbean carnival music, dance and culture. Occupying the streets colourfully and noisily gave out a tremendous message of, we are at home here. coming from a minority often mistreated and discriminated against. In the 1970s, the authorities, and in particular police, were often hostile to the carnival and sometimes attacked it with considerable violence. And this is what happened in 1970. Today, however, the carnival is generally supported by a public body. It would be typical to see carnival artists invited into schools to talk about the carnival. The Notting Hill Carnival is now part of the image that Britain wants to give to the world. You can see in the Paris metro from time to time, when there isn't a virus around, big posters, "Come to Britain for the biggest Caribbean festival in Europe, the Notting Hill Carnival." So this process by which the Notting Hill Carnival changed its symbolic role and its role in the British public image is parallel with the rise of multiculturalism. And I'm sure you remember that multiculturalism is not just having people of many different colours and origins. It's a public policy encouraging the expression of minority cultures. That's the idea of multiculturalism. That's why it's an ism. It's a set of ideas. Although in the last 10 years, British politicians are less keen on using the word multiculturalism, it seems to me that many multiculturalist practices established in the 70s, 80s and 90s are rooted in British public life and are not likely to change very quickly. And just one last, I've only got to August, but I won't be doing every year with so much thoroughness. Just one last element to get back to popular music. August 1970, the Isle of Wight Festival. I think you can see some of the, perhaps you can see some of the stars who are available here at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970. Yes, we have Joan Baez, Donovan, The Doors, Joni Mitchell, and people of that nature. Okay, so this is the festivals had begun. The first big outdoor festivals of popular music were the jazz festivals, and they also could get quite violent at times. The Isle of Wight Festival then was very symbolic, if you like, and the number of festivals has grown since. Many of the festivals in the late 60s and early 70s were free festivals. But that tended to disappear, and certainly today the Glastonbury Festival is extremely expensive if you want to go there. Well, I've got to half an hour, and I like to do these videos in half-hour chapters, and so I will see you in chapter 3, and I will stop there. We're in August 1970.